Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you logged on to join us today for CommuniTeas. CommuniTeas is an ongoing series hosted by the Lewis Honors College Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Council. The purpose of the CommuniTeas series is to provide an intimate setting for guests from across UK and the Lexington area to share their research or their passion with the Lewis Honors College. It is spelled TEAS because when we are not under COVID safety precautions, we do serve tea and cookies. Hopefully we will be able to resume this in the fall. In this series, we aim to highlight individuals who are change makers in their fields and whose work showcases concepts that are powerful and intersectional. Our conversation style gatherings encourage faculty, students, and staff to join in the discussion and further explore ideas that generate thought-provoking conversations and help connect our students with important people across the community. Our guest today is Kentucky native Alex Acquisto, who joined the Lexington Herald-Luther staff this past June to cover health and social services for the news organization as part of a nationwide project called Report for America. This program places talented emerging journalists into local news organizations to report for 1 or 2 years on undercovered issues and communities. Acquisto is one of 61 journalists referred to as core members selected from a pool of nearly 1,000 applicants for Report for America in 2019. Acquisto spent her childhood in Owensboro and graduated from Western Kentucky University before studying at the Salt Institute for Documentary Studies in Portland, Maine. She was a reporter for the Bangor, Maine Daily News since December 2016, first covering the state's lobster and tourism industries on the Mid-Coast, then leading the paper's metro coverage in Bangor before finally reporting on Maine politics in the state capitol. In her work there, she uncovered problems with the legislature's mandatory sexual harassment training that led to the ousting of its trainer. And her reporting on the deaths of children in Maine prompted a legislative investigation into the state's overburdened child services agency. Acquisto's reporting here focuses on Kentucky's health problems, exposes flaws in the state's social services programs, gives voice to people struggling to care for themselves and their loved ones, and offers potential solutions to problems that have plagued the area for a century. Welcome to the Lewis Honors College, Alex.
Thank you.
We're so glad to have you here. We always start by asking, what is your educational journey? What professional and educational journey led you to the work that you do?
So I didn't go to journalism school. As you said, I grew up in Owensboro, which is in Western Kentucky. And for college, I went to Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. And I didn't study journalism. I studied English literature and American history. I did not know that I wanted to be a journalist when I was in college. I think if you had asked me then, I probably would have said I wanted to go into academia of some kind. I don't really know. And so I kind of arrived at working at newspapers sort of circuitously and a little bit by chance. After college, I moved to Maine, as you mentioned, and went to the Salt Institute for Documentary Studies. It was sort of a supplemental graduate program for a semester, almost like a residency, kind of a hybrid of the two. And my focus was on kind of narrative nonfiction. They have radio writing and photography. And so there I got to write really not hard news, but kind of featurey things, and realized that I really did like writing, but still didn't quite know that I wanted to work for newspapers. So I bounced around a little bit after that. I worked at a publishing house in New York for a hot minute, and then moved back to Maine, wanted to stay there, thought that my career would maybe lead me to writing for magazines, because again, I'd only experienced that narrative writing and honestly wasn't very good at it yet. And so I just tried to get any job I could. And the first job that I ended up getting was for a very small weekly newspaper off the coast of southern Maine. Kind of from there, I worked my way up. So I didn't go to journalism school. And honestly, now I think that I prefer it that way. I think that journalism school can give people a lot of great skills and insight and set them up for a really good career in journalists, but I kind of like that I came to it in that way and didn't have formal education. I never even really worked for a college newspaper, high school newspaper, or anything like that. So yeah.
Well, we love to hear that. The answers to that question is they're always so interesting. And I think it's good for honor students in particular to hear because they can be put on a pretty regimented path early on. And I think they need to know that many of us had some twists and turns in our career path before we found what we wanted to do. We also have a lot of writers in the honors program. Dr. Falstick especially has courses that ask students to think about writing, and we have esteemed poet on staff, Rebecca Gale Howe. So we have a lot of honors courses that are writing intensive. How do you handle the job expectation of constant output as a writer?
You get used to it. In the beginning, it was hard because I think this maybe was the biggest detractor for what didn't prepare me. Not going to journalism school, I think, gave me a lot of advantages. One of the things that it didn't prepare me to do is to write clean and quick and not be so attached to every story that I wrote, because sometimes the priority is just getting the information out. So that took me a couple of years to learn how to do comfortably and then to do well. So now you're used to it. I'm used to it just because it's part of the job. Any journalist who's been doing it for a long time is used to it. You get in the habit of it. And, in the beginning for me, because I care about the quality of my work, just like any reporter does, I think you have to maybe choose one or the other. I couldn't write well and write quickly. Now I think I can, but, and I'm used to it now, especially right now it's the end of the legislative session in the General Assembly. And so our politics reporters are churning out multiple articles a day, which seems like a lot, and it is, but you just sort of get used to it, to where it doesn't seem like a burden or a high expectation anymore. It's just baked into the job.
Yeah. We hope for our students, of course, that their time in the honors community can help them find their calling. And journalism isn't just a job, it's a public service. And it can certainly be a form of social justice activism as well. I suspect, based on what you have written in the past, some sense of social responsibility informs your work. Could you share with us your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, my lens as a journalist, what I deem newsworthy is informed by what I think is important. Being a journalist is objective to a degree, but it's also very subjective because you choose what to highlight. There is sometimes very obvious news that you cover, functions of the legislature, for example, not to harp on this, but then other issues, like this past year as the country was sort of having a racial reckoning, so were many newsrooms around the state and the country with how do we as journalists in an industry that is dominated by white people cover these very real issues? Are we covering them well enough? No. How do we cover them better? How is our lens as white people, how do we tell stories through that lens? How do we get better at telling other people's stories through that lens? So sure, my opinions and what I think is important very much influences what I think is worth covering. But I don't know, it's always something that you're refining. And I have this conversation a lot with colleagues because it is challenging sometimes. And I can't think of a specific example to give you other than to basically say, yeah, it does happen. And it's always sort of a work in progress. Yeah, that was kind of a roundabout answer to your question. Feel free to follow up on it.
No, that's okay. That's a great answer. It's a great answer. So sometimes I noticed online you're described as a watchdog reporter. Can you tell our audience what that means?
Yeah, I don't know if I would describe myself that way. It's basically just it's like a investigative reporter. It's a name for like an accountability reporter, sort of. I actually don't know if I would describe myself that way. I think we do have watchdog reporters at our newspaper, and I think all of us can fill that role sometimes. But it's a heavy emphasis on accountability reporting, which a lot of journalism just inherently is accountability reporting. But I guess this is a little bit more involved, sometimes involves, more in-depth stories, that sort of thing, about some of those accountability issues. Or just like if you're taking an institution, like let's again focus on the legislature, delving into a specific topic and holding people who are in positions of power to account through reporting.
How has the changing political landscape, in which some political leaders have expressed open hostility towards journalists, or at least encouraged skepticism of their work, how has that affected your experiences as a journalist?
It's affected them a lot. Just like most journalists, I think, especially the last 4 years were very difficult. Not very difficult, but I mean, all things considered, journalism is people have a collectively different idea of what journalism today is versus even a decade ago. When in my opinion, journalism only continues to get better. And so when you live in a country where it's normal to refer to what is a reliable institution, which is journalism, as fake news so flippantly, or to constantly sow doubt in the legitimacy of it, it makes it really hard. And also, even people who are well-intentioned, I think, fall into it, which is what makes it so problematic. I'm sure every journalist, myself included, have had experiences even with family where people say something that undercuts your work, or just the reliability of journalism, or people kind of forget what journalism is with the constant flood of information on social media, where you can basically find a hot take on any subject very easily on Facebook. But it doesn't mean it's journalism. And I think even people who grew up with getting 2 issues of the same paper a day kind of forgot what journalism is like, just because it gets confusing when elected representatives always sow doubt. So not stand on a soapbox, but it has made it difficult to not do the work, but I think just contend with that doubt, which is overwhelming. Everybody's had conversations with people who call you fake news. And I don't know if there is a really good way to overcome it, other than kind of going at the problem directly, talking to those people who have those opinions, which I have done, and lots of people have done. And some people won't change their minds, but I think it makes a difference to people to actually have a face-to-face conversation with a journalist, as opposed to just hear an elected leader say disparaging things about journalism and how all journalists lie. Because again, I think people don't know. Some people willfully choose to ignore that, but it's definitely an issue, and one that has frustrated me, sure. But I still continue to do my job the same way. And if anything, it just makes me think that my job is more important because of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how do journalists ensure that their coverage is accurate and factual?
Going to the source. So it sort of depends on what it is, but earlier today I wrote a story about 3 bills that just got final passage in the legislature. And so to make sure that what I'm writing is correct, I want to make sure that I understand the language of the bill. I want to maybe call experts to tell me their understanding of the bill to make sure that mine lines up with theirs. It's deferring a lot of times to people who know more than you do. And also it's just sort of critical thinking, vetting ideas with colleagues, going over things with editors, knowing where to find reliable, corroborating information if you need to. So those are kind of the black and white things. Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's a simple but also complicated thing. So yeah.
How do you know how to ask great questions that unearths pertinent information?
Also a simple but really complicated. I mean, sometimes I err on the side of it's like if you ask questions for a living, you come to know what the right questions are. So at a very basic level, during Governor Bashir's press conferences that he has had for a year now during coronavirus, if you want to get information on something, you want to ask a question, one that hasn't been asked before, or that the answer doesn't easily exist somewhere else. And then oftentimes you don't want to ask a yes or no question. Sometimes you do, depending. But basically, question that leads somebody to divulge the most information that you can. So, like questions that pack punches. A lot of open-ended questions. I tend, if I have time to interview a subject, just ask as many questions as possible and let them talk. But I'd say those two things make good questions, sort of open-ended, not yes or no. And then obviously, you just don't want to look dumb by asking a question that the answer exists already. So again, complicated, but simple at the same time.
What is it like covering a pandemic?
Wow. Unlike anything I've ever done before, like everything else this year, but I'm lucky enough to wear my beat because it's public health and social services. I've gotten to cover the bulk of it for the paper. And so I have actually really enjoyed it because it is narrowing, or it's narrow in the sense that you're covering one topic, but within that topic, there are so many different things to write about. And so I actually have really liked that structure because it's not just about the fact that a disease exists that's like infecting and killing people. It's all of these different things. So like, how does it affect our public health system? How does it disadvantage certain populations? Who has access to a vaccine? Who doesn't have access to a vaccine? Who is most at risk? People who live in congregate care settings. How are business owners dealing with it? How are they disadvantaged? So honestly, like countless stories to pursue. And I really have liked and enjoyed the structure of sticking with this one topic. I've gotten tired of it too, just like everybody has, but sticking with this one topic and then picking out just different things within that to kind of dig into. And of course, I've been doing it from home, which has its own challenges.
As I was reading your work, I was thinking, my goodness, we could use this as an example in Honors 140, which is our foundation seminar, Knowledge and Society. We ask our students to think about how we know what we know. And at one point in the course, we asked them to think about a topic, but come at it from a lot of different directions or perspectives or disciplines. And one of the things I like about your work is that you do that. So, some of your coverage of the pandemic has been what people might expect, like includes data on numbers of cases and other kinds of concerns like that. But sometimes it's a real kind of personal profile. Mm-hmm. Do you have a preference or any kind of feedback on that you want to provide?
Well, I definitely prefer writing the second type of stories that you mentioned. Every day, me primarily, and sometimes my colleague, have been writing sort of daily number stories that you mentioned, which are necessary and provide people with like that snapshot of information that they need to know. How many new cases do we have this week or this today? But it's not interesting in the way that that's not the type of journalism that gets my fire going, I guess. I enjoy writing the stories that you mentioned, which are basically how are these all different groups affected by this thing that we are experiencing. So like take healthcare workers. Early on in the pandemic, they didn't have enough personal protective equipment. What did that mean? And so I wrote a story, I think it was last April, which is crazy that it was almost a year ago, about how nurses primarily, just because of their hierarchy in the chain of healthcare personnel, felt like collateral because they weren't given adequate PPE. So basically what I did is just try to make connections with nurses, curious about their experience, wanting to know what it was like, and wrote about that. So that is the type of journalism that I prefer, which allows me to really dig into people's stories, people's experiences, whether they're disenfranchised by something, whether they have a choice. In this case, these nurses didn't. They didn't have enough. Most of them didn't have N95s at the time. They had to reuse paper masks, which we know aren't really effective. And so that really feeds why I love journalism, which is getting to pursue and write about things that I'm curious about. I just get to do it for my job. So those are the stories that I most prefer writing.
Well, at this point, we will open up questions to the audience. Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask, or if you'd rather, you can type your question in the chat. Quiet out there. Well, we'll let you think for a minute, come up with some good questions. One thing that my predecessor liked to ask was, you know, you need a break from the pandemic sometimes. What do you do to decompress? What do you watch or listen to?
I watch a lot of things. I listen sometimes. Honestly, it depends. I sometimes listen to true crime podcasts, which maybe seems like a weird way to decompress. Usually what I do, I've been like rewatching a lot of shows that I've watched before that are comfortable and sort of mindless to tune out while I'm cooking or something. I've been reading a lot more this year, primarily because I'm in a book club. Some of those members are in this meeting. And so that has really helped, having that goal of not just reading for myself, but reading to talk about in a group, even if those get-togethers are virtual. So reading has been more cathartic for me. And sometimes reading's touch and go, since I like basically read for a living. I get tired of it sometimes, but you know, a lot of rewatching Parks and Recreation and things like that.
Great choice, of course. We do have some questions in the chat now. Why did you choose to apply for the reporting program you are a part of, and did you get to choose Lexington?
I did get to choose Lexington, and I applied for it. Great question. Because I wanted to move back to Kentucky, which when I left Kentucky, I did not think that I would want to move back. I lived away for almost a decade. I moved right after college to Maine and lived there for 9 years. And I actually applied for RFA the first year that it was open, and I was a finalist, but I took myself out of the running because I don't know, wasn't ready or something. But I wanted to move back to Kentucky because I'd never been a journalist here. And so it just became convenient that this job became available, and I applied for it and got it. But yeah, Lexington was my top choice for a newsroom. I can't even remember what my other choices were, but I specifically chose to come here because I wanted to come back and work in Kentucky.
And another question is, what do you enjoy most about living and working here?
I really like being a journalist in a state where I have roots, which was something that I took for granted a lot. I left Kentucky initially, I think, because I really wanted to live in a different state that had different demographics than the ones I grew up around, social demographics. And I guess is like more of a personal answer, but I really enjoy now, but didn't always, living in a place where I have roots and being a journalist here because Kentucky is such a dynamic state. Maine was beautiful and interesting, but it only has 1.3 million people, and there's more conflict in Kentucky. And I enjoy being here because a lot of that conflict is personally interesting to me. I have a tug of war relationship with the state, I think, which is again why I moved away. But yeah, so all of those reasons make me really love being here.
Oh, my literary friends, who was it that said they never met a Kentuckian who wasn't on their way home? There's something about that, right? Kentuckians love Kentucky, and I admire that. I'm a Hoosier myself, and I have not found that to be true of Indiana, but it seems to be true of Kentucky.
Yeah, there's a lot to romanticize.
Yeah. We've got a question about writing mentors. Do you have writing mentors? How do you choose mentors? And what do you get from those relationships?
I don't know if I have like personal relationships with mentors necessarily. Of course, there are journalists like many of my colleagues who I really admire a lot. And maybe they're mentors and I just haven't thought about them as mentors, but I have more writers who are older than me, whose work, actually not all the time, whose work I really admire and want to emulate and strive for. But actually, having a mentor is something that I have wanted, I think, especially more as I get older, the longer I become a journalist, because I recognize the value of it. But I don't know if I actually have one right now. There are just a lot of journalists that I admire and think are really good at their job and want to be as good as they are.
Other questions from our audience?
I can ask one. I guess my question is just about paywalls and journalism and media. Like in some of my poli-sci classes about media, we've talked about how certain websites certain news sites that lean a certain way have paywalls, other ones don't. And I guess we've talked a little bit here about journalism and news being a public service. So I guess I wanted to ask your opinion about like, if any news site should have a paywall, what's the sort of pros and cons of that? Like we know that plenty of local newspapers are very much strapped for funds. But yeah, I guess like what's your opinion on that? Should any news be behind any sort of paywall?
I mean, I think that news is and should be accessible to everybody, but I also think that people should pay for their news because I make my living off of creating that news. And so it's controversial because in an ideal world, sure, I would love to work for an organization that is so well funded that we could give people free news all the time. But in the same way that I guess anybody makes the product of their skill available and you have to purchase that, I think that people should pay for news that they love. I think that people should pay for news if they want to be informed. It's an ongoing conversation that we have with readers. I think about, my grandmother who lives in Owensboro used to subscribe to the Courier Journal, used to get 2 issues a day. She paid for that print subscription. And she was happy to issue it for years. And plenty of people do that. And what makes it tricky is when news becomes digital. And so again, let's talk about disinformation for a second. You can get information on social media and it be free. People become conditioned to the idea that all journalism should be free. And I don't think it should. And I don't think there's really, I'm sure there are some journalists who do, but so it's not even a double-edged sword. It's just 2 sides of the same coin, I suppose. But I think because real journalism is content created by skilled journalists, which is different from information that you can find on social media, I do think that people should pay for it. But I also think that it's good to have conversations about it. And it's okay if people would disagree with me. I have an opinion because I am a journalist creating that news. And again, I make my living off of it. But I also understand if people choose not to. So it's a complicated subject.
Great question, Dan. Thank you. As I like to say in class, we're a community of scholars, so we want to make sure people participate. We have another question in the chat. A lot of times, especially at the beginning of a career, people tend to feel insecure about their professional identity. Was there ever a point in your career where you had a breakthrough and thought, this is really me? I'm a journalist and I do great work.
Yeah, I definitely, because I wasn't on, I think if you had asked me when I was 25, if I wish I'd gone to journalism school, I would have told you yes, because I didn't have a defined career trajectory. And as a result, I think I flailed a little bit, which plenty of people do, and that's okay, because I found my footing and am doing now what makes me really passionate and happy. And I hope I do it for the rest of my life. I hope I can get paid to be a journalist. But Yeah, I think it was probably soon after I started working for local community papers and actually got better at it that I realized that it was something that was fulfilling to me. This was what I wanted to do. And this was also the type of writing that I wanted to do, at least for now. So, but I didn't find that until I got a job in the industry. Would I have known that sooner if I'd gone to journalism school? Maybe. But yeah, so I think I was honestly think I was a little bit late when I had that epiphany. I think it was around 27. Before that, I had an existential crisis, but then I came out of it.
Great. Zeta has a question.
Got one. So I just read Silas House's piece that's very provocatively titled "Eastern Kentucky is Underwater and You Probably Don't Know About It."
Mhm.
And it's been making me think the past couple of days about what issues are underreported in Kentucky or what issues don't make a national splash, and there are a lot of them.
Mhm.
For a lot of really negative things and not for a lot of positive things. And I guess the question I want to ask you is what newsworthy in Kentuckians right now that you feel are underreported or that you would like to see, have a wider circulation?
That's a really good question. I haven't read that piece from Silas, but generally as a region, Eastern Kentucky is undercovered. When I got this job, one of my tasks was to report more out of Eastern Kentucky. The pandemic has made that hard, but there are so many issues that are undercovered. And one of them, which is kind of covered in a superficial way, not for the fault of anybody in Kentucky, but just because it's such a deep issue that has so many roots, is child abuse, I think. And all of the things that stem from that, I think, stories that deal with public health determinants, sort of the disadvantages that people in rural parts of the state face, the things that are stacked against them, is another kind of broad issue that's undercovered. And so, yeah, I'm trying to finish a piece now about prosecution of some of those child abuse cases. And when I say it's covered in a superficial way, I mean that most people, if you read a headline regularly in Kentucky, know that we have a really high rate of child abuse. We have ranked the top state in the nation for rates of child abuse per population. Second is West Virginia. But what does that mean? And so digging into that more, sort of all the trauma that comes from that, families where that happens, how are those cases prosecuted, or rather, how are they not prosecuted? Because most of them are not. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's another thing where if I, as a journalist covering public health, which is such a massive issue and also encompasses so much, there are a lot of things that are undercovered here. And I get daunted often that I'm not doing a good enough job to cover those things. But I think one of the conversations that journalists in the state should continue to have is remembering or thinking, always reassessing the quality of your work, the content that you cover, and also what are you not covering is as important of a conversation. Long-winded answer.
Other questions?
Alex, you said a little bit ago that you were like, I like doing this kind of writing right now. And it made me think maybe in the future you would write some other way. And so I'm sort of assuming that maybe you're thinking like a book, which is maybe a tiny bit similar to Zeta's question, then like if you were going to write a book about an issue, is there something you'd like to pursue for that length of time? Or perhaps you meant an entirely different kind of writing, which would be interesting to hear about too.
Yeah, I think I wasn't talking about a book specifically, but do I hope that I write a book one day? Sure. I think probably most journalists do. I do not have anywhere near the level of expertise right now to write a book. I think my dream scenario would be to do what Beth Macy did, maybe she still works for the Roanoke Times for decades, and then wrote a book about the opioid epidemic. And she also wrote another book just because her sourcing was so deep and she knew the subject so well and she knew the state so well. So that's something that I hope to do eventually. More so what I meant when I said that was, I don't know if I want to, I think I want to write journalism in some capacity for the rest of my career. What venue that's for, I'm not sure. If that transitions into longer form journalism, for newspapers, not for newspaper, not sure. I am really curious about the mediums that exist inside journalism and the different ways to tell stories. And so I wonder what that will look like in the future, but I don't really have an idea. Just curious.
Thanks.
Mhm.
What else do you?
I have a,
Oh, good.
sorry,
No, please.
I have a quick question. So I'm not too familiar with journalism, but I know I've like heard like the purpose of it would be to just like to empower the informed or uninformed.
Mhm.
And so going back to your what you were discussing about child abuse in Kentucky, what are your hopes to get or to provide the public with, like if you are able to cover that in the future?
That's a really good question. So I guess fundamentally, I view my job as providing people information that helps them make more informed decisions or just helps them have more informed understanding of issues that exist around them. And so on this issue particularly, I guess it would be more aimed at, people who know these issues exist don't need to be reminded that they exist, but insofar as how could we improve our system to better support families where abuse occurs? What laws or statutes exist to support children who've been victims of abuse? What could we do better as a criminal justice system to prosecute more cases of abuse? What can we do to strengthen that system? I guess reporting in an ideal world that I would do would help spur that conversation along. People actually in charge of making changes at those levels would make them. But I think there's also value in reminding people in your community that these issues exist just so that they understand more about them. So not that they can look for them more, but there was a bill, I don't know the status of it right now, before the legislature that something to the effect of providing teachers or school staff with basically trauma-informed training about how to recognize abuse. So I think, being informed that abuse is rampant in your community, in your state, maybe helps you better recognize those sorts of behaviors in a child that you know who is abused, or just like having that awareness, that cognizance that these things are an issue, I think has value. But the first part, I think, is my highest hope with reporting on that issue. If that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I have another one if we have time for that. I guess another question would be, what is your sort of, and maybe you could speak to this based on your time when you were working in Maine, like as a Kentuckian, or just your experience still working at the Herald Leader, like when you like interact with sort of like national news outlets or outlets from outside the state or outside the region in general, do you find yourself like they want to portray the region in a certain way and you kind of have to push back on that? Like they want you to kind of, say a certain thing about Kentucky or Appalachia. I feel like there's been a lot of like reporting as of late as sort of, people want to come in and examine like what the Trump voter is. And like, obviously books like Hillbilly Elegy have not, helped in that cause. And so I guess, yeah, have you experienced any of that or any sort of experiences, people being having thoughts about you being from Kentucky when you worked in Maine or anything like that?
That's a great question. Yeah, definitely. People have perceptions of Kentucky, as we all know, and they're not attractive. When I lived in Maine, one of the biggest factors in me wanting to come back and this sort of slow burn move or desire to come back was kind of twofold, and it really started to pick up steam after the 2016 presidential election, when there was a lot of coverage on who the Trump voter is and why they vote the way that they do. And being from Kentucky, I know a lot of Trump voters. I have Trump voters in my family. And some of the reporting I felt like was really broad brushing. And, you know, boy, isn't it easy to antagonize broad swaths of the population just because they voted for this president. But knowing people who voted for him and understanding the nuances of those decisions, and also being an established journalist at that point, it made me want to tell those stories, and also made me defensive of the people that were sources in those stories. So definitely, and I think that that goes to, like, I like living in a region where, or in a state where I have those familiar ties, and where that conflict exists, because I feel like it gives me better insight into some of these dynamics that you were talking about. But so it's less that it plays out in conversations that I have with national outlets, which I don't really have any. But I think that, you know, everybody criticizes parachute journalism, which national outlets are often guilty of, not all the time, because national outlets cover some issues very well. But parachuting into a community, reporting without nuance, and broad brushing all of the people and the issues. And so, yeah, I think that really kind of single-handedly drove me to want to come back, because I saw that as an issue, and you described it really well.
Another question from the chat. You've used the word fulfilling to describe your work. Is your work ever fun? Is it possible to have fun while doing work that is often very serious?
Yeah, so when I say fulfilling, I mean fun. And it's probably not fun in the traditional sense. I think it is fun. It's oftentimes involves writing about unsightly or not good subjects, hard things, especially if we're talking about child abuse. But I think when I say fulfilling, I mean I get personal fulfillment out of understanding the role that I serve as a journalist, which is to publicize issues that are important. And so it's kind of hard to separate. Yes, it's fun. Yes, it's like really fun to break a story, especially if you're working on it with colleagues and you're collaborating and you publish it first. Heck yeah, that's awesome. Everybody wants to do that. Writing harder stories. There was a story in Maine that me and a colleague followed for a long time about this 10-year-old girl who was really severely abused by her parents and ended up dying. It was a horrible, horrible story. And it was really hard to write at times and still really haunts me, but it was fulfilling, and I felt very privileged to be in the position of getting to tell that story. And so that, even though it's difficult, gives me fulfillment, if that makes sense.
We have time for another question or two.
What is that book you're reading in the book club?
Oh, I thought you were talking about behind me. Right now we're reading a book that I actually can't remember the title of because I haven't read yet, but it's about Walt Whitman, about Leaves of Grass specifically. But I haven't read it, so I can't tell you about it.
Have you read anything lately you recommend?
Yes. Let's see. I'm rereading right now, kind of to help my reporting. So I am reading rereading Missoula by John Krakauer, which he looks at a bunch of sexual assault cases at the university in Missoula, and it's really good, and what happened with those and how they are mishandled. I'm still making my way through Furious Hours by Casey Sepp about the murder that Harper Lee researched for a long time and never wrote a book about. And then I'm still reading, but I haven't finished Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner, which is a beautiful book, but I haven't finished it.
I highly recommend Furious Hours. I love that book.
It's really good. Yeah, I'm almost finished.
So, yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Well, where can people access your work? Where can they learn more about what you do?
You can, so I have a website, but you can subscribe to the Lexington Herald Leader. You can follow me on Twitter. Those are probably the main places to follow my work. Yeah.
Well, we thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for joining us here today. And I thank everyone who attended and asked questions. We appreciate all of it. We hope that you come back and see us sometimes at Lewis Honors College when we can have you in person.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, you all asked really good questions. Thanks for asking them.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.